In 1985, a group of guys walked into a studio with no plan, no deadline, and absolutely no filter. 3 days later, they walked out with an album that got banned across multiple countries, refused by major distributors, and blacklisted from record stores. It also accidentally invented an entire genre of music. This is the story of S.O.D. So at the end of the last video, I teased that something was brewing on the side while Anthrax was putting together Spreading the Disease. Something louder, faster, and considerably more chaotic than anything the band had done before. Well, here it is, and honestly, the story of how Stormtroopers of Death came to exist is almost too ridiculous to be true. Let's go back to 1985. Anthrax is in the studio tracking Spreading the Disease, and anyone who spent time in a recording studio knows that there is a lot of waiting around. Scott Ian, Charlie Benante, and recently departed bassist Dan Lilker, who had left Anthrax to form Nuclear Assault, were all hanging around the studio together with nothing to do and entirely too much energy. So they started jamming. But here's the thing, the seeds of what would become S.O.D. had actually been planted even earlier than that. While out on the road with Anthrax, Scott Ian had been sketching this comic book character in his downtime. He called the character Sargent D, an over-the-top, cartoonish, aggressively opinionated military figure who spouted deliberately absurd, satirical slogans. Scott Ian wanted to turn it into a published comic book, but had no idea how to make it happen, so instead, he started writing songs about him. The songs were fast, short, and hyper-aggressive. They were hardcore punk songs that matched the character's unhinged energy. When he, Benante, and Lilker started jamming those riffs out in the studio, it clicked immediately. They just needed one more piece, a vocalist. And they found one in Billy Milano, a local New York guy who was a friend, a roadie, and a singer for a hardcore punk band called The Psychos. Milano had the attitude, the aggression, and the voice for exactly what they were building. Stormtroopers of Death was born. Now, before they were S.O.D., they briefly went by the name Crab Society North, which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously they were taking this at first. Under that name, they recorded a demo tape, 63 songs, many of them lasted 10 to 15 seconds. This was not a band calculating their market strategy. This is 4 guys in a room having the most fun they'd ever had making music with absolutely zero filter. Leveraging Anthrax's existing relationship with Megaforce Records, S.O.D. got studio time to record proper album. And then they did something that genuinely sounds like a tall tale, but is completely documented. They wrote, recorded, and mixed their entire debut studio album in 3 days. So yes, you heard me right, only 3 days. And the album was called Speak English or Die. It was released in 1985. The record was short, chaotic, funny, and brutally heavy. It was unlike anything that existed at the time because it was genuinely 2 things at once. It had the raw, stripped-down aggression of hardcore punk and the precision and heaviness of thrash metal. Nobody had really put those 2 worlds together like this before. And that collision turned out to be historically significant in ways nobody involved was expecting. Now, we do need to talk about the controversy because Speak English or Die is not a comfortable listen, and pretending otherwise would be doing you a disservice. The album's lyrics, written from the perspective of Sargent D, is deliberately over-the-top cartoon character were aggressively provocative. The title track targeted immigrants in blunt, confrontational language. Other tracks went after foreign cultures, and then there were songs many listeners found deeply offensive towards women. The record didn't exactly tread lightly on anything. That was the whole point, or at least it was the intent. The fallout was real. Major labels like MCA and A&M refused to distribute the album in Europe. Canadian record stores wouldn't stock it, particularly sensitive given the political tension around English and French language politics in that country. The album only made it to European audiences at all because Cease Wessels at Roadrunner Records was willing to step in and distribute it independently. The band's defense has always been consistent. It's satire. It's Sargent D talking, not Scott Ian. The character hates everyone equally. That's a joke. Ian has said this in some of his most serious, aggressive tracks where sitting right next to songs about being hungover or running out of milk. And that tonal whiplash was intentional. Dan Lilker put it simply, the goal was to be obnoxious and provocative, full stop. At the pushback against accusations of genuine bigotry, the band later wrote, "We All Bleed Red," a track that explicitly condemned racism and hate. But here's where the honest conversation has to happen. A lot of music critics and listeners have argued over the years that the satire didn't fully land. And there's a reasonable case to be made there. The effect of satire usually turns its sharpest edge on the bigot, on the oppressor, and on the person with the power. When the targets of the humor are marginalized groups without a clear punchline that exposes or condemns the prejudiced viewpoint, a lot of people are going to hear it and not see the joke. They're just going to see the slur. Scott Ian himself has acknowledged it in more recent years that if the band tried to release Speak English or Die today, the internet would absolutely not be kind about it. And vocalist Billy Milano's later political commentary with his follow-up project, M.O.D., gave a lot of fans reason to look back at the original record with more complicated eyes. But here's the thing, and this is what makes S.O.D. such a fascinating case study. The musical legacy of this record is almost impossible to overstate. What Scott Ian, Charlie Benante, Dan Lilker, and Billy Milano did in those 3 days essentially created an entire genre, crossover thrash, the fusion of hardcore punk energy with thrash metal precision. It didn't really exist in a codified form before Speak English or Die, and I know Suicidal Tendencies was doing it a little bit. They came out in 1983, I know that, but this album really solidified it. They drew the blueprint, and everything that came after it in the space was downstream after what S.O.D. did. Before 1985, the metal and hardcore punk scenes were not friendly neighbors. There was genuine animosity between those communities, sometimes spilling into actual violence at shows. S.O.D. ignored all that and just smashed the two sounds together. And once people heard it, the walls started coming down. And the bands that followed, the aforementioned Suicidal Tendencies, DRI, Cryptic Slaughter, Corrosion of Conformity, all built on the crossover framework that S.O.D. established. And the influence goes even further than that. The heavy mid-tempo palm muter breakdown riff, what people now call the march part, was essentially codified on this album. The opening of March of the S.O.D. is widely considered the original template for what would become the defining structural element of groove metal, metalcore, and eventually deathcore. Pantera, Hatebreed, any band you've seen make a room explode during a breakdown, they're all working from a formula that Charlie Benante and Scott Ian were sketching out in the studio in 1985. And on the other end of the sonic spectrum, the hyper-short, blast beat-driven songs of this record helped catalyze what would eventually become grindcore. Napalm Death and the UK underground scene took this ultra-fast, ultra-brief format to its logical extreme, and they've cited S.O.D. as a direct influence. There's also the MTV angle, which is genuinely wild. March of the S.O.D. became the opening theme for Headbangers Ball. The network's weekly heavy metal showcase. Another track, Chromatic Death, was used as a transition theme going into commercial breaks. Millions of metal fans who had never bought the record maybe couldn't buy the record given its controversial distribution history, was still hearing Scott Ian's riffs on their televisions every single weekend. And then there's what S.O.D. did to Anthrax itself, because working on the project wasn't just a fun side adventure, it changed how Scott Ian and Charlie Benante approached their main band. The raw, fast, hardcore influenced energy they let loose on Speak English or Die came right back with them into Anthrax. You can hear it. The band that made Among the Living, the album that many fans consider their masterpiece, was sharper, harder, and more aggressive than the band that walked into spreading the disease. S.O.D. was the pressure valve that ended up supercharging the engine. United Forces, one of the more earnest tracks on the record, became something of an anthem for exactly the scene unity that S.O.D. helped create. Punks and metalheads dropping their tribalism and coming together under one loud, sweaty banner. That ethos reshaped the live music landscape in ways that are still visible today, and every time you walk into a heavy show and see that unified pit. 3 days in the studio, one ridiculous cartoon character, and a genre that didn't exist before and didn't exist after. That's Stormtroopers of Death. Now, S.O.D. was supposed to be a one-off, a pressure valve, a joke that got out of hand in the best possible way, and in terms of being a full-time band, it pretty much stayed that way. But what it did to Anthrax was permanent. Scott Ian and Charlie Benante walked back into the main band with a completely different gear engaged, harder, faster, meaner, and with something to prove. Because as good as Spreading the Disease was, the music press still wasn't fully sold. Anthrax was still being treated as the fourth wheel of the Big Four. The scrappy New York underdogs hadn't quite had their moment yet. Among the living was that moment. Released in 1987 and built around the writings of Stephen King and the imagery of Judge Dredd, it's the album where everything, the riffs, the vocals, the attitude, and the production, locked in at exactly the right time. A lot of people consider it not just Anthrax's best record, but one of the defining albums of the entire thrash metal era. And that's the next chapter, and it will be a good one. In the meantime, check out the playlist of the story of Anthrax. This is the third video in that series, and I will be doing all albums, possible EPs, and maybe some side projects up until the release of the new one. So, thanks for watching. See you in the next one.